Hi, I'm Nivedi, and today I'm going to be presenting on zoning law and environmental injustice. Environmental injustice is a movement that emerged in the 1980s in response to the disproportionate citing of hazards in communities of colour and lower income communities. It stated that those that live, work and play in America's most polluted places are people of colour and people of low income. And examples of this we can see in Flint, Michigan with the water crisis, and in Louisiana in the Cancer Alley. So how does government policy, environmental injustice and race intersect with one another? Well, zoning in the form of racial covenants, as we can see here, which were written into the deeds of homes, and stated that no persons other than one of the white race shall be permitted to occupy certain properties. This then created racial segregation in urban spaces. And we can see how this hypersegregation in Kansas City, where Troost Avenue works to segregate whiteness and affluence in the west from low-income communities of colour in the east. And we can see that on the map here, where white people are represented by blue dots, and the green and yellow on the right of Troost are Black people and Hispanic people. And the government then decides where the hazards are placed and therefore creates communities that are seen as increasingly hazardous. These communities are already marginalised due to the racial and economic segregation, which is exacerbated by present-day urban planning through local zoning, which is decided by the government and paid for through taxpayer dollars. And zoning law was created with the aim of protecting the health, safety and well-being of the public. But because zoning law decides what land can be used for, it can therefore work to create spaces with increased hazard to the environment and the health of some. And with that, my research project aims to answer the question of how does local zoning law impact environmental injustice by restricting how spaces are used. So first, to look at some literature on local zoning and environmental injustice. Local zoning works to protect the economic interests of homeowners in neighbourhoods that are deemed as desirable. Zoning controls traffic within and around the neighbourhood. It restricts the type of buildings permitted within the zone land and keeps undesirable land uses out. Zoning can act as a gatekeeper that keeps hazardous land uses away from residential areas and allocates other land for industrial uses. And we can see that in this map, in this diagram here, where residentially zoned land is the most regulated and has the most restrictions on it. The only land use that's permitted in residential zone land is single family units. And at the bottom, we can see manufactured zone land, and that permits residential, commercial, and manufacturing land uses. It's the least regulated and the least restricted. So why does this matter? Well, zoning determines what can and cannot happen in a defined space codified in law, which affects the overall organisation of a city, and where industrial places and residential neighbourhoods become entrenched and fixed over time. And manufacturing zoning is in place to protect residential zone spaces. Both manufacturing and residential land are dependent on one another, meaning that those that live within the manufactured zone land often face more harm. And so, again, my research aims to answer the question of how does local zoning law impact environmental injustice by restricting how spaces are used. I used a mixed method approach in Kansas City as a case study, and I collected both quantitative and qualitative data for 3 neighbourhoods. The quantitative data was health statistics, demographic information, home values, and environmental information. And I also collected qualitative data such as photographs. The 3 neighbourhoods that I collected data on are Leeds, the East Bottoms, and Squire Park. Both Leeds and the East Bottoms are manufactured zone land, but they also have residential land uses within them. Squire Park is a residential neighbourhood and was selected as a control neighbourhood that controls for race to help us understand how there are other forms of injustices that work beyond race. And here we can see a zoning map from 1924. We can see the East Bottoms at the top of the screen and Leeds at the bottom. They were both zone manufacturing, and then Squire Park was zoned residential. And it's clear that looking at the development of zoning in Kansas City, that there were actually residential land uses there before the land was zoned. So that helps us understand that there were people there in these spaces before the land was zoned manufacturing. And so here we can see that all three neighborhoods fall east of the racially dividing line of Troost Avenue. The East Bottoms is located in the northeast of Kansas City. It has a minority population of 47%, and it was once a thriving community, home to an amusement park and a large distillery. But now, and over the past decades, we've seen a large decline in the population size, and it's now isolated by rail yards and large wooded bluffs. Leeds is located in the east of Kansas City, has a minority population of 63%, and it was one of the first communities in Kansas City where Black residents could actually own a home. And again, like the East Bottoms, there's been a large decline in the population size there, and it's now isolated by highways. And finally, Square Park has a minority population of 73%. It's a historically Black neighborhood, and today we see having a large neighborhood organization. And so what are these neighborhoods like now? Well, we can see from the East Bottoms here that there's residential land uses in close proximity to hazard, such as the factories that we can see in these photos, railways and warehouses. They also lack important resources. They don't have any grocery stores, there's no hospitals, there's a lack of quality parks and other social infrastructure that are essential for strong communities. And then the same applies for Leeds. We can see that the residential land uses are in close proximity to the hazards. And both Leeds and the East Bottoms have higher levels of linguistic isolation, which is defined as no one in the house over the age of 14 speaking English very well. The percentage of the population that are linguistically isolated in the East Bottoms is 15%. In Leeds, it's 13%, and in Square Park, it's 0%. And with linguistic isolation comes further exclusion from government decisions, as there can be a lack of understanding or education surrounding decisions within the community. And we can see in the health data that Leeds and the East Bottoms have worsened health outcomes than the Kansas City average. They have less access to preventative health measures, such as having access to quality parks that promote physical activity. Leeds and the East Bottoms also have little access to medical facilities due to their isolated locations, and they have less individuals with health insurance. And we can see here with the home value that the East Bottoms and Leeds have significantly lower home value than Squire Park. This means that asset accumulation over time is lessened, meaning that this reproduces the inequality that we see in these neighborhoods. And the environmental data was collected from the EPA, and it allows us to see that Leeds and the East Bottoms are in closer proximity to hazardous land uses than Squire Park. They also have higher levels of proximity to traffic, and as a result, they have larger levels of diesel in the air. However, this isn't everything to do with environmental hazard in these neighborhoods, and the EPA can only show us so much. There are hazards within these neighborhoods that don't show up in any EPA mandated lists, and therefore they often go unrecognized. And so using GIS, I was able to map other places of hazard within these neighborhoods to help us understand how, because the land is zone manufacturing, other hazardous land uses are permitted there that often go unrecognized by the EPA. And Leeds and the East Bottoms are also included in future plans. They're included in the Riverfront Industrial Area Plan, and this aims to revitalise these neighbourhoods. And we can see that in the East Bottoms, the aim for this neighbourhood is that they're going to remove all the residential land uses within there. And this helps us understand how zoning law removes the neighbourhood's legal capabilities in resisting new industry. And this leaves these neighbourhoods that become perceived as blighted, as the East Bottoms is by many, vulnerable to future development plans, which could work to displace the residents, and we can see that in the East Bottoms. Zoning law maintains the lack of essential resources and infrastructure, whilst maintaining the facilities that cause harm. However, also permits new development at the expense of residents and the neighbourhood, creating neighbourhoods that are vulnerable and have weakened protection because of the zoning regulations. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, it's clear that the neighbourhoods of Leeds and East Bottoms are drastically different to Squire Park. Leeds and the East Bottoms have considerably lower home values, worsened health outcomes than the Kansas City average, and less access to preventative health measures. Leeds and the East Bottoms have higher levels of linguistic isolation and are therefore less likely to be able to comprehend the environmental data for the neighbourhoods, creating more vulnerability. Therefore, local zoning maintains the protection and restriction of certain spaces that works to promote health, safety, and well-being, whilst permitting hazardous placement in others, which can have detrimental effects on the communities. Zoning law limits the capital one can acquire, it reduces the resources available, and it restricts the legal capacities communities have against hazardous placement or redevelopment. Government decisions surrounding zoning law are maintained by taxpayer dollars, which will continue to create and reproduce hazard if not abated in any way. So overall, we can see that policy of land use can exacerbate the existing social inequalities of space in a way that hasn't previously been explored. Thank you, and I hope that this presentation helps you understand how important zoning law is to environmental injustice. And if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to ask me.